This video is about the language that we use when we talk about disability, why it needs to be changed, and how we can change it. The main reason that we need to look at and change our language is that words matter. The words that we use both summarize our reality and create our reality. So it's important that when we're speaking about disability, we're not creating a false reality by using inaccurate language, because ultimately any falsehoods that are spread about disability are to the detriment of disabled people. I also want to note, as I'm getting started, that of course the disability community is vast and varied, which means that we certainly all have different experiences. However, I think that a lot of what I'm saying are things that many within the disability community do agree with me about, and I primarily think this because of a lot of disability studies literature and a lot of inter-community conversations that have helped me to develop my model. I also am aware that a lot of families are thrust into the disability community, often without any warning, and that there may be a learning curve in learning about the disability community, ways to talk about disability, and what disability looks like in life. However, when you're in the midst of that learning curve, that's the best time for your intimate moments to not impact the public narrative. Oftentimes, particularly with young children with disabilities, families are quick to say our life would be so different if it weren't for this disability, which is true. However, your life would also be so different if there were more accommodations. Your life would be so different if you had access to more information about how to support your child, which, as a hint, you often do through the self-advocacy community, so I recommend taking advantage of that. What I'm getting at here is that all emotions are valid, but some reactions to those emotions, particularly those that further marginalize an already marginalized community and spread false information about that community, are neither acceptable nor valid. So now let's talk about some truths in relation to disability. The first truth is that disability happens. A lot. According to the 2012 US Census, approximately 19% of the United States population has a disability of some sort. We should also be able to agree that the disability experience comes from both our individual abilities and skill sets, and also the environment and accommodations in relation to those skill sets. This is very consistent with the social model of disability, which discusses how individuals and their environment both combine to create the disability experience. The third, on a related note, is that disability impacts life, and that the surrounding environment and the available accommodations mediate that impact. This axiom is reflected in the World Health Organization International Classification of Functioning model, which describes disability sort of as a three-part experience. So the first is the impact on the individual, just from a bodily and mental standpoint. So, as an autistic person, I have what would be considered sensory processing deficits. And then on an activity level, those experiences cause me to become overwhelmed in very loud, crowded environments, which is the second part. And then the third part is the participation level. So in my case, I often find myself opting out of loud parties or concerts or other things that I know would be overwhelming, which can have an impact on my social experience. And if I know that there's going to be, say, a place that I can escape for things to be quiet, somewhere that I can sit quietly, or a few other accommodations, I'm more likely to try it and then succeed in that environment. I really like that model because I think it brings to light the importance of accommodation. Because as you can see, the impact of my disability on my life experience can so easily be mediated by accommodations when my needs are considered. Fourth, people with disabilities are full, complex people. That seems to be a fact that we remember and then forget and then pretend to remember by forcing person-first language, and it can sometimes be hard because a lot of what we're seeing in the media is very stereotyped images of disability, occasionally with some inspiration porn thrown in there. And we truly do need more complex representations. But in the meantime, something that will help us to get there is to remember that people with disabilities are full, complex people. And the final fact I'll discuss today is, like its predecessor, more so a fact about the world than about disability specifically. Although, aren't they all? But the fact is that success takes many different forms in many different lives. When we picture successful people, and when we hope for success for ourselves, that looks different to all of us, depending on our values, depending on what's important to us, and depending on whether people are given the opportunity to take advantage of their own skill sets and interests. So now I'm going to discuss some narratives that I typically hear related to disability that fail to embrace these facts. The first is the narrative of disability as a sad and unexpected burden, especially for families. This seems to be the most common way that disability is talked about. I hear things like, the journey we thought we were on is changing, and of course I'm angry, my son has all these challenges, and words like tragic and unfortunately. But then sometimes they refer to non-disabled siblings in the sense of, but his brother is okay. So first I'm going to say, let's not use words like fine or okay in contrast to disabled, because sometimes non-disabled people are not fine or okay, and sometimes disabled people are fine and okay, and those stati don't have as much to do with disability so much as they do with the human experience. And to imply that a disabled person is not fine or not okay by virtue of what may be a very long-lasting experience in their life is pretty disrespectful. Second, what if, when we had kids, we expected that they might be disabled? Again, I want to touch on the fact that according to the 2012 census, nearly 1 in 5 Americans had a disability of some sort, and I am aware that that takes into account acquired disabilities, disabilities acquired through age, and a myriad of other statistics. But disability happens. Children are born disabled every day. And I think it's time that we start saying when we have children, I am willing to raise whatever child is given to me, and I'll love them. Because that's kind of parenting 101. Let's not assume that children are going to automatically be part of the majority, and let's not view it as a tragedy when they don't, because chances are they won't, and it's not. Another thing that I see is discussion of the incurability or lifelong nature of a disability being framed as tragic, and often in a way that displays lots of sympathy and other feelings toward a disabled person. But what if we saw living with a disability as another example of living with a full, complex life? What if we said, yes, autistic people are going to be autistic their entire lives. Yes, disabled people are going to be disabled their entire lives, if that's what the disability brings. And what if we took all of the energy that we spend thinking about that, and we thought, wow, we better make sure we have a world that's accessible for them. And we need to consider the different ideas of what success might look like. It seems that we often get very bogged down in this capitalist, everyone for themselves idea of the world, when truly we have the resources to go around. We have the technology to automate enough things that now more than ever, it's really easy for us to be supporting everyone who needs that support. And the final narrative that I want to discuss today is one that I've really been noticing lately, which is the tendency to take a smoke and mirrors sort of position when talking about disability. So it seems like people want to talk about disability just enough, but there's such a hesitance to really just acknowledge disability and acknowledge its impacts in a way that is true and respectful and doesn't need to go to the point of being dehumanizing or insulting. So, for example, obviously, I would disagree if somebody said, the disabled life is a tragedy. We've discussed this. However, I also disagree when people say that people with disabilities are just like everyone else, because the whole point of disability is that there is a disability involved, which is a different experience and necessitates accommodation and necessitates understanding of what expectations might need to be adapted. So I think that the risk we run into when we're saying people with disabilities are just like everyone else is then failing to accommodate and failing to do the things that would support the person who's living with a disability in a way that helps them to be involved in community. I also know that a lot of the intent there is really that people speak in a dehumanizing way about disability. However, we can say people with disabilities are people, and they're valid people, without having to assert that the only way to be a valid person is to be like a non-disabled person. And now I'm going to touch on some common counter-arguments that I hear. I also want to point out that a lot of the time people bring these up as though these are newfound thoughts that I haven't arrived. I have already considered these, ruminated on them for years, because I just couldn't get a full model out of a lot of the way that we're talking and thinking about disability, and then became involved in the disability community and learned the things that answered the questions I had been pondering for years. So these thoughts are really not just like things I came up with in the shower. They're things that finally answered the questions I spent years and years pondering in the shower. So a lot of the arguments that I see being tossed at my comrades in disability advocacy, and that I've also run into myself, say that those of us who advocate disability rights and self-advocacy are naive to the impact of disability, or are fools because who's going to fund diversity, or are much less disabled than insert the identity of some disabled person whose personal information they're probably sharing without their permission. And the truth is that yes, there's a variety of disability in the world. That disability has a variety of impacts. However, to have one part of the disability experience is to have more parts of the disability experience than a non-disabled person. Additionally, ability and functioning are context dependent, and there are many people who have experienced many parts of life that every person who meets them doesn't see. And finally, self-advocacy and safety are important. I mean, when we look at the numbers even of disabled people who run into horrible abuse at the hands of the people who are supposed to be caring for them, it really shines a light on the importance of honoring self-advocacy and focusing on the respect of disabled people all the time and in all aspects of our society, and of doing so without forcing disabled people to constantly frame themselves in a way that simply appeals to people's sense of pity. Plus, I think if world history and even current political events shows us anything, people's sense of pity and horror is often not good for much, particularly in the immediate. The next one that I hear is, and pardon my John Mulaney impression, but haha, I've met people with disabilities who disagree with what you're saying. Yes, again, people with disabilities make up almost 20% of the US population and are complex people. As such, not all of us have come to accordance at our annual meeting of disabled people, and we're still working on finding a conference room that will fit all of us and accommodate all of us, so feel free to help with that. But all snark aside, a lot of the times, we see things and our experiences not as they are, but as we are. And this is true particularly in the sense of kids who are growing up surrounded by a certain narrative. A lot of the narrative about disability is untrue and is harmful and really frames disability as the core of the problem. So when a kid is every day getting in trouble for being disruptive in class, and they hear, oh, it's your autism making you do this, it's your ADHD making you do this, how do you not grow up and say, I hate my autism, I hate my ADHD? But what if instead we told these same kids, oh, you're having a hard time in this environment, let's find out what you need? And then I think those kids would grow up and say different things. And I also see a lot of people saying, I have a child who cannot communicate, and he would not agree with you. You seem to know a lot about how he thinks, considering the lack of communication. Apparently the mind-to-mind is working well for you. But also I want to point out that there is no living creature that doesn't communicate. Just because we are requiring the communication to be linguistic and failing to acknowledge any other form of communication does not lack of communication make. One very specific criticism that I once received was, but some people can't use a spoon to feed themselves. And that is so sad. So this person, I think, had missed the point. Because truly my view of the world, and the factual view of the world, is that we all need assistance doing different things, and that's the point of being an interdependent world. Note the word interdependence in contrast to independence, because none of us is truly independent unless we are living in the middle of the woods with no internet, in which case you're likely not watching this. So if you've decided that a person's disability is devastating because there's a certain task that they are unable to do independently, perhaps try considering what other ways can that thing get done. Does the person need supports to be able to do it themselves? Do they need a person to come in and help them to do it? How can we get access to those? And if you reach a point where you say, we can get access easily, then it sounds like you've solved the problem. And if you can't, then what kind of world are we living in where people need supports and we as a society are capable of offering them but are not coming forward and doing so? Unfortunately, that is often the world that we live in. But that's not disability's fault. Another criticism that I sometimes hear is, well, you've never met my disabled cousin, who screams and hits himself. Self-injurious behaviors, and any behaviors for that matter, are often either solely a form of communication, or more frequently, just a clear incidental communication of a need. In the past, I have experienced self-injury, as have a lot of my disabled friends, often because of sensory needs that aren't being fulfilled, or because of needs in emotional processing and emotional coping that weren't being fulfilled. So rather than pitying that this is something that's happening, let's start really looking at that kind of communication, as much in the way that anyone learns communication. When we see that our expression of something has then been met with a need being fulfilled, we learn to do it again, and we learn to hone that ability into even more intentional forms of communication. The final criticism that I hear often comes from a very emotional place. Again, if it's frustration with your current experience, it's a great idea to reach out to other disabled people and learn what supports they think could possibly be helping. And it's also a good idea to really look at what services would help the person in your life and to help that person advocate to get what they're needing. Sometimes, though, the emotional place is simply one of, I have a right to mourn what my child could have been. We touched a little bit earlier on there being a difference between the private moments and the public narrative, but at the end of the day, you have a right to mourn, certainly, if that's what you're going to choose to do. But we in the disability community have a right to wish that you would have been prepared for whatever child the world brought you, and that you would have loved them for whoever they are, fully, in a way that also includes respect and understanding and a pledge to learn and grow with them. And we will continue to hope that you're willing to do so. So, when you're talking about disability, I would really recommend asking yourself some questions about whether what you're saying is in line with those axioms. Am I acknowledging that disability is something that happens? That accommodations and supports have an impact on disability, as does the environment? That people with disabilities are full, complex people? And that success takes many different forms? If so, you're probably on the right track. I really think it's important to also just use as much detail as is relevant when talking about disability. If something's not relevant to the conversation, you don't need to say it. However, if you're trying to discuss a person's needs or a person's difficulties, framing that through the lens of accommodation, framing that through the lens of an aspect of life, and framing it through the lens of success in and of itself, to advocate and get needs met and to communicate in whatever form it comes, I think we're really going to be on the right track.